Let's look at the documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car? I saw this, I want to say in 2007, when oil prices were starting to tick up. And my father had just bought a motorcycle because oil prices were so high, and motorcycles usually get about 50 miles a gallon or so. He came over and we watched it. Very frustrating. A lot of people in the U.S. were really struggling. At the bank, what was happening was we had people who were defaulting on their mortgages because they didn't have enough money for oil. Their oil costs went from $120 a month to $480. Some of them was even more than that. It was just, people were struggling bad. And I believe that oil prices continued to stay high. I can't remember if it went through 2008. I want to say it did. It's all fuzzy now because the crisis just proportionally got worse. But yeah, people's wallet was being drained. Well, as it turns out, and a lot of us didn't know this until this documentary came out, there was an effective electric car produced by GM, which was the EV1. Which is interesting. Apparently, this project was disbanded long before 2007-2008. Now, how much money would GM have made in 2007 and 2008 when consumers were hurting from high oil prices? And this documentary, I point this, it has excellent hindsight commentary in the sense that at the time, the people who are producing this don't know what's about to happen, and they don't know what's going to happen, even about 9 years later. But if you were to watch this now, you would see a very good example of what happens when you don't think about what's good for your consumers. GM, terrible idea. Terrible business approach. This documentary wasn't produced during the bailouts, but remember, they received a taxpayer bailout after engaging in this behavior shown in this documentary. Again, think about it. How much money would they have had? They would have had the solution to a problem, right? So there's a lot of good information in this documentary, okay? There are two critiques that I have of it. Number one, there are a lot of people in the film that are complaining, whining, and griping, okay? There comes a point that complaining is done. You got to move on and start focusing on solutions. Telling other people to solve your problems is less effective than solving your problems, right? That's a big minus. And the documentary doesn't really highlight that. If I was shooting this documentary, I would say, well, there does come a point that, let's stop relying on GM. Let's start creating competition. And by the way, at the time, there were some startups. And now look at Tesla Motors. And now you have the Nissan Leaf. So you got the Japanese getting in the game, right? There's a lot of competition now to GM. GM's lost, right? And then the documentary, like many films, doesn't grasp business as well as it should. Now, it's a great business film. This would be perfect in a business class or an entrepreneurial class or a capitalism class, you name it. The reason is, look at a short-term approach. It doesn't work. GM, yeah, they made a lot of money temporarily, but boy, did that fail in the long run. There's a great example of why you always do what's right for your consumers in the long run. You play the long game. And look at how much money they would have made when oil prices ticked up. Because it would have been much cheaper to buy the EV1 than it would have to be paying $480 a month in gasoline prices. But for those of you who don't know, in the banking industry at the time, that was one of the many reasons why people were defaulting on their mortgages, is because they couldn't afford the oil prices. It was going up too high. So it was a really hard time of suffering with oil prices. But on the flip side, you now see solutions to this problem. So this is a great documentary. I think that if I was teaching a business class, this would be a documentary I'd highlight and show people, like, this is an example of short-term thinking and not thinking about your customers in the long run. It's an excellent, excellent hindsight documentary, as you can see how it all plays out now knowing these things and how many people want to do business with GM. So if you want to know why I would never do business with GM, watch this documentary. You'll see some good examples.